Lori talked a little bit about what our priorities are, and unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, the fire itself is going to cause problems from the flame and the smoke, obviously, and you're going to have problems from firefighting efforts. Putting water on something isn't the greatest thing in the world to do for collections, obviously, and the physical destruction, as I mentioned in the slide before, that we sometimes have to do in order to get to the seat of the fire. So we're not trying to hurt things purposefully, but we do have to do some demolition type things and again, putting that water on there in order to get the fire itself out. Our priorities at fires are always rescue first, extinguishment second, and property conservation third. We like to be doing all those at the same time. Simultaneous working on those three things is fantastic, but at this particular fire we had some trouble with access. We were trying to get into the attic, which is where the fire occurred, and that prolonged the amount of water we had to put on, and it delayed our ability to do property conservation. Again, as I showed you there, we relocated much of the owner's possessions to that uninvolved garage. And if we could go to the next slide, you'll see that in some instances we can't move things around. That piano would have been very, very difficult, and so we threw salvage covers over the top of that, covered it in place, and sometimes we'll actually be throwing those covers as we're moving through the structure trying to get to the fire itself. So we do a quick and dirty job right away, and then we try to, later on when the fire is under control, get those things either moved or get them covered in place. I might mention to you that at Mount Vernon, I know it is normal procedure for the collections folks there to pre-cut and in some cases cover their objects that are in storage ahead of time, because they have a sprinkler system there that will put out their fire should they have any, but that's obviously going to cause some water damage too. And so they're using culturally sensitive materials like polyethylene or polypropylene that won't cause any problems, and they have those things covered up or are ready to cover those up with pre-cut materials. And the last thing about this fire I'd like to say is that at this particular incident, and something that I'm presuming is happening across the country and you have to be really careful about, is we call them trolling disaster restoration companies. We are starting to see folks before the fire is even under control a lot of times with their trucks that say disaster and fire and water restoration, and they've got their business cards in hand, and they're waiting to accost the building owner with their services and give them the hard sell and everything. And you're in a very vulnerable position at that point. And we do our best to try to isolate you from them. I remember whispering in the ear of the owner while this fire was still going on, hey, be careful, there's some folks over there behind there that are going to try to solicit business from you. My best advice is to have this worked out ahead of time with your insurance carrier, so you don't even have to worry about having that kind of a confrontation at an emergency scene. Heaven knows that's the last thing you need to deal with at that time. If we could go to the next slide. So a lot of what we're talking about today is relationships and building those with first responders. Obviously, everyone's going to have a different personality. Different departments are going to have their own personalities as to how much and how aggressive they are with customer service. One thing that you might mention to people, or keep in mind, I should say, is everyone's being forced to do more with less, and so you may not have some of those emergency agencies being as enthusiastic about your request as you'd like. One tack you might take is to explain to them that salvaging collections is really just an extension of the salvage efforts that we make as a basic service at every fire and emergency, like I showed you in those slides of our fire. And that really it's families' personal collections that are being protected at most of those homes, and those should be as important as the collections that are in institutions and public places. You should have those kind of on the same level. You also might mention to them that you are offering to assist them in their pre-planning efforts. Pre-planning is a term that we use in the fire service for any ability we can to find out things ahead of time. Lori mentioned where the utility shutoffs are, what your priorities are as far as salvaging materials. If we have to make some choices, what would you want to be taken care of first? Where are your emergency exits? Where are your sprinkler shutoffs? All kinds of things like that. If you use that term pre-planning, that might help you get in the door. You could talk about having a facilities walkthrough at your place for each of the shifts. Most places are on a 24-48 shift, 1 day on and 2 days off, which means you'd have to do it 3 different times, and what the responders will be noting as they would go through. You might, as a last little hint, do some bartering. like maybe offering to help with displays that they have at their fire stations and at their city buildings or with their historical collections. Everyone's trying to do a lot of different things, and you have that special expertise, and you may be able to offer that in exchange, and that might, again, open the door for you also. So build those relationships, get a hold of those folks, and let them help you out. Lori?
I'd like to add a couple more things. As Dan said, you don't want to come across as being a gimme, gimme, gimme institution. You can change that attitude and possibly crack getting access to your emergency responders by letting them know what you can offer to them. So you might want to start simply by providing your emergency plan to your local emergency responders to have them keep it on file. It requires no effort on their part, and yet it provides a lot of information for them when they might have to come to your institution. As Dan mentioned, a walkthrough would be possibly a next step where you're inviting them in and they have a very critical eye and can help tell you things that you can do to improve the safety at your institution. And then maybe the next level up, you might want to invite them to do a site assessment, to work with you to help determine what the risks are, what the hazards are at your institution, as well as how you might mitigate some of those hazards that are there. So invite your emergency responders to come to your institution. You can invite them to conduct training activities at your facility, hazmat incident response, even an active shooter response. Emergency responders are always looking for venues to practice their training, and this is a wonderful way for them to understand what it is in your facility that's important to protect and how they would work in any kind of situation. You could also host community disaster preparedness workshops, whether it's for your local emergency management agency or an institution like the American Red Cross. So I want to speak very briefly about a national program with goals of bringing together the cultural heritage and emergency professionals before disaster strikes, and that's the Alliance for Response. Thanks to funding from the Fidelity Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities, Heritage Preservation has held forums in 18 regions across the country since 2003, and the results have been pretty stunning. There have been disaster networks. There's training both for the emergency management community as well as the cultural heritage community about each other's communities. And there have been real changes in policy at the institutional level, at the state level in terms of new annexes to emergency plans, as well as changes certainly in awareness at the federal level. These networks are really important for raising the profile of cultural heritage in the world of emergency response. So if your city or state is shown here and you weren't invited to an Alliance for Response forum, I encourage you to connect with that network. And with that, I think we will open it up for questions.
Elsa, it looks like we have one up there from Anita. I can go ahead and try to answer that somewhat. Is there a standard procedure most cities would follow, or is each city different? As far as fire and EMS and emergency services, and law enforcement, most places I think you're going to see follow a fairly standard procedure. I mentioned to you those priorities of rescue, firefighting, and salvage and property conservation, and almost everyone will use those as their priorities regardless of where you live. Now, where you're going to see some differences is in things like I had mentioned earlier about the health departments. I know in our county there are some folks that are covered by their local health department that is part of their city. Our town is actually small enough. We have about 34,000 people that we contract with our county health department for those kind of things. And so they are the primary one that we would go to if we needed some assistance on that end. The Red Cross, of course, being a national organization, and FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and those are going to be pretty much the same. But your local EMAs may be somewhat different also, your local emergency management agencies. Again, just to give you an example, in Ohio there are some EMAs that are staffed by one person. I mean, that is it. They do everything. They answer the phones, they take the notes. It's usually a director, and sometimes it may even be someone that either a volunteer or part paid or something like that. The same thing's going to happen also with your fire departments. If you have volunteer departments, You might have a paid chief or a part-paid chief, or everyone might be volunteer. And so there you're meeting with your local citizens and local residents who do this on the side, and it's going to be a little different, obviously, working with them. You're going to have to tap their expertise, but you're going to have to work around their schedules because they're doing this on the side and they have another job that puts the food on the table. So again, it's some of those things are going to be different, but a lot of those maxims as far as actual operations and those kind of things at an emergency scene are probably going to be pretty similar.
Dan, why don't you share your knowledge of the incident command system with us?
Sure. And Lori, I don't know if we have it coming up anywhere, the book that was written. I know that it's on your site and everything, but I had a chance to look at a little bit of that and all. And the incident command system, and they talk about this in the book that's meant for cultural institutions, is a system that was set up from chaos, is really what it comes down to. We, even though we're supposed to be on the same page as far as what we do and everything, don't always or didn't always work in that direction. And the incident command system really came about from the wildfires, and unfortunately you're seeing those in Texas and some other places today, but the wildfires out west, especially in California, those things are what we call campaign events. And we say campaign meaning this isn't your little backyard fire type thing. This is something that is involving departments from throughout the state in California a lot of times, and throughout the country sometimes. When you see smoke jumpers on television, on the news and everything like that, and you see people on those fire lines and all, pretty big deal. And in fact, the National Interagency Fire Center that sometimes commands these fires out in California is in the Midwest, in Boise, Idaho. So you see that, okay, I've got a guy here who's in charge, and he's not even in the same state, let alone close to the fire. Well, that system is meant to be able to handle that, and it's a scalable system that can be anything from, in my world, a car fire where there's just one truck on the scene, up to that disaster where a tornado came in and took down an entire neighborhood, to that giant disaster like your wildfires and those kind of things. And what they tried to do was to get a system set up where everyone could understand how to organize these chaotic scenes, and also so there was commonality in terminology. I was telling Lori yesterday when we were preparing that when I teach, a lot of times I use the example of the term tanker. If you are in Ohio and you are at a scene, and let's say one of you was the incident commander and you requested to your dispatcher that you needed some tankers on the scene, you're going to get a number of vehicles, ground vehicles, that have a lot of water in the back. That's just common terminology there. However, if you were out in California and you were at the same scene and you asked for tankers, you're going to get airplanes flying overhead. They're going to be dropping water on you. Two different locales, same term, two different meanings. And so the incident command system brings commonality to all those things and allows us to be able to help each other without wondering what is it exactly that they were looking for here. And it does everything from setting up the person in charge to breaking it down to manageable units. And without getting into lots and lots of detail of it, we usually like to have a span of control where there's one supervisor for at a maximum of 5 to 7 people or 5 to 7 fire engines and that kind of thing. And you can do the same thing in your own institution. I mean, somebody's going to be in charge there when you have an emergency of some kind. If you're a single, you just have one person in your place, then that's going to be you most of the time because it's your place that we're coming to help. If you have those mutual aid folks coming in from other museums, you're going to be in charge and want to have tasks for them that you need to do.